Rome's heavy cavalry didn't charge the enemy. They charged their own men. The most fearsome mounted warriors in the Western Empire, ironclad from helmet to hoof, bred and trained for a single devastating purpose, came thundering backward through the Roman line, crushing everything in their path. And the man responsible for stopping them, rallying them, and somehow still winning this battle, had been reading philosophy in Athens 2 years earlier. Contemporary records document the arithmetic of what followed. 13,000 Romans against an enemy force that Ammianus Marcellinus, the near-contemporary historian who drew on the accounts of men who were there, estimated at 35,000 Germanic warriors. Rome's partner army of 25,000 had already abandoned the campaign before a single soldier from Julian's force drew his sword. A deserter had told the enemy commander exactly how many men Julian had. The enemy had taken 3 full days just to cross the river. So what did Julian do? He marched forward and attacked. But here's the question that historians keep returning to 16 centuries later. Not the tactical question of how he won, but the human one. Why did the Germanic king Hannibal, who had just destroyed a larger Roman army, who held overwhelming numbers, who possessed precise intelligence on Julian's weakness, why did that king secretly arrange escape boats before the battle even began? His own warriors forced him to fight on foot rather than on horseback because they didn't trust him to stay. He had already planned to run. This was a king who knew his coalition was built on distrust and coercion, who understood the fragility of everything he had assembled, and chose to attack anyway. The chronicles record what happened next. They never fully explain what he thought victory would actually look like. You'll discover the single pre-planned counter-tactic that Cannae had engineered specifically to destroy Julian's heavy cavalry. Months before the battle, before the armies ever met. You'll learn how Julian rallied his broken horsemen while Constantius's political agents watched from the Roman lines, and what he was forbidden to say while doing it. And you'll find out what punishment Julian gave the regiment that refused to return to the fight. One of the most unusual acts of military discipline in late Roman history, documented by the historian Zosimus. To understand why a philosophy student became one of the most dangerous battlefield commanders in Roman history, we need to go back not to the morning of the battle, but to Constantinople in 337, and the moment Julian's cousin decided the world would be safer without his family in it. The year 350 should have been a moment of Roman stability. Constantine the Great had died 13 years earlier. His empire distributed among his sons, the chaos of the 3rd century seemingly behind Rome forever. Instead, a military officer named Magnentius murdered the Western Emperor Constans at a banquet and declared himself ruler of the West. What followed was not merely a political crisis. It was the catastrophe that made everything at Strasbourg possible. Constantius II, sole surviving son of Constantine, marched west to reclaim the empire. He won. Eventually, defeating Magnentius at Mursa Major in 351 and driving him to suicide in 353. But the price was the Rhine. Every available Roman soldier had been pulled from the frontier and thrown into the civil war. The Germanic tribes beyond the river noticed immediately. Ammianus Marcellinus catalogues what happened with the precision of a man who understood that numbers tell truth when words fail. Mainz, Worms, Speyer, Saverne, Seltz, Strasbourg all fell to Germanic occupation. The entire Rhine defensive line, the Limes Germanicus that Rome had maintained for 3 centuries, collapsed in a matter of years. Of all the major fortified positions on Rome's most critical northern frontier, only Cologne survived, its heavy walls holding when everything around it failed. Germanic raiding bands were not merely crossing the river anymore. They were reaching the Seine, deep in the Gallic heartland. Ammianus notes, with an undertone that suggests something about the scale of the chaos, that Silvanus was considered brave simply for leading 8,000 men along a woodland road in Gaul. Because the ambush risk was so severe that doing so required genuine courage. The strategic situation Constantius inherited after his civil war victory was, in practical terms, a Roman Gaul that existed only on maps. 3 strong points remained in Roman hands along the entire Rhine: a single tower near Cologne and 2 small forts at Remagen and Koblenz. Everything else was German territory now, not raided, not threatened, but occupied. The Alemanni and Frankish confederations had crossed the river, destroyed the Roman fortifications, and settled. They were not going home. Constantius was not a man with good options. The Sassanid Persian Empire was pressing in the east, requiring his personal attention and the bulk of the empire's best forces. Gaul needed someone capable of fixing everything, answering simultaneously to military necessity and political obedience, managing a demoralized army in hostile territory, and doing it without acquiring enough prestige to become a threat. The power dynamics couldn't have been more stark. Constantius needed a commander loyal enough to be trusted, obscure enough to be controlled, and somehow capable enough to actually win. He was running out of family members who met even 2 of those requirements. The man Constantius chose was, by every reasonable metric, the worst possible candidate. He was also, as it turned out, the only one who could do it. When Julian was 5 years old, his cousin ordered the murder of his father. The precise mechanics of the Constantine family massacre of 337 have been debated by historians ever since. But the broad facts are not in serious dispute. When Constantine the Great died, his sons moved to secure their inheritance. What followed was the elimination of virtually every other male relative who might complicate the succession. Julian's father, Julius Constantius, was killed. His older brother was killed. His mother had already died in childbirth. Of the extended male line descended from the second marriage of Constantius Chlorus, Constantius II left alive exactly 2. Julian and his half-brother Gallus, 7 years older, spared most likely because of their youth. Ammianus Marcellinus records that Constantius was later tormented with guilt over what had been done. This, if true, was a somewhat belated response. Julian grew up in a form of gilded captivity. He was educated, first by a Gothic eunuch named Mardonius, who instilled in him a passion for Greek philosophy, classical literature, and the old pagan tradition that would eventually define and destroy his reign. Then, when Julian was around 14, Constantius grew nervous about a Constantinian prince being too visible near Constantinople. And both he and Gallus were sent to the remote imperial estate at Macellum in Cappadocia, essentially a comfortable house arrest that lasted 6 years. He was watched. He was managed. And somewhere in that isolation, surrounded by books from the library of the Christian bishop George of Cappadocia, reading the philosophers Constantius had tried to suppress, Julian underwent the transformation for which history would name him. He stopped believing in Christianity and started believing in paganism. This was not an intellectual curiosity. Under Constantius, a zealous Arian Christian who had made the old pagan religion increasingly legally precarious, discovery meant death, or at minimum, the end of whatever narrow future Julian had been permitted to imagine. He hid it. He performed Christianity with sufficient conviction that Christian intellectuals of the era later wrote, with genuine confusion, of his, quote, zero conversion after taking power. because his deception had been that complete, maintained across roughly 2 decades. In 354, the last protection was removed. Gallus, elevated to Caesar of the East, had governed his territories with what Ammianus calls quote one. Brutal, erratic, paranoid, Constantius had him executed. Julian was now the sole survivor of the family purge of 337, watched more closely than ever, summoned to Constantius's court and held under effective suspicion for a year before being cleared. Then, on the 6th of November, 355, the solution arrived. Constantius, who needed someone for Gaul and had nobody left to send, elevated his last living male cousin to the rank of Caesar. He married Julian to his own sister, Helena. And he dispatched him west to fix the unfixable, packing him off to Gaul with a small retinue and the expectation that his prefects would keep the young intellectual safely managed. According to the historian Britannica draws from Ammianus, Julian arrived at court still wearing his student's gown. He was 23 years old. He had never commanded an army. Cynical members of Constantius's court reportedly viewed the assignment as an elegant solution, an easy, innocent way to remove yet another potential rival through enemy action. What Julian found in Gaul was a province that had given up. But someone had made it give up. And that someone, at that very moment, was watching from across the Rhine. The Romans called him Gigas, the giant. Ammianus Marcellinus describes Cannae in the kind of physical detail that suggests the historian's sources had actually seen the man. Prodigious stature, exceptional strength, a flashing helmet. Gold-leafed, almost certainly, the kind of parade armor that announced its wearer's importance before he said a word. He was the driving force behind the Alemanni Confederation, joint paramount king, alongside the considerably less memorable Westraup, the acknowledged mastermind of the Germanic occupation of Roman Gaul. Ammianus calls him, in a phrase that carries more than a little professional respect, the quote four of the invasion. The Alemanni were not a kingdom in the conventional sense. They were a confederation. The name itself likely meant quote 5 or quote 6, a declaration of purpose rather than ethnicity. Germanic tribes occupying the lands east of the Rhine and south of the Main had coalesced over the course of the 3rd century into this loose alliance of kings, princes, and nobles, each commanding their own warriors, each theoretically subordinate to a paramount leader when the situation demanded collective action. Underneath Chnodomar sat 7 other kings, 10 princes, and a long train of nobles, each nobleman capable of raising roughly 50 warriors. It was a structure designed for flexibility in peacetime raiding and ambitious enough, when unified, for something more serious. Chnodomar had built his reputation on a record of victories against Rome that, by 357, was difficult to argue with. He had driven Decentius, the military commander of the usurper Magnentius, from Gaul. More recently, and more relevantly, he had routed the Roman general Barbaccio and his army of 25,000, twice the size of what Julian now commanded, in the weeks immediately preceding Strasbourg. He had been told by a deserter from that scattered force exactly how many men Julian had: 13,000. The arithmetic seemed, from where Chnodomar stood, conclusive. The coalition he assembled for the final push against Julian was the largest Germanic force ever gathered against Rome in this region. Ammianus records its crossing as taking 3 full days. A captured Alemanni scout told the Romans the army was still crossing when its vanguard had already reached the west bank. Among the contingents were warriors whose kings had been coerced rather than convinced. King Gundomad, a loyal Roman ally who had maintained his treaty obligations, had been assassinated in an ambush. His co-king Waldemar had been forced at sword point to break his Roman agreement and march. The Confederation was not unified by loyalty. It was unified by momentum, by the scent of a weakened enemy, and by Chanadomar's certainty that this was the moment to finish what the civil wars had started. There was, however, a structural tension in all of this that Chanadomar could not quite resolve. His warriors had noticed it too. Before the battle, his infantry would demand that he and the other kings fight on foot rather than on horseback. Not because foot combat was more glorious, but because they didn't trust their leaders to stay if the fighting turned against them. Chanadomar accepted this demand. According to Ammianus, he had also, quietly and privately, arranged for escape boats to be waiting at the Rhine. He was a king preparing to demonstrate certainty about a victory he had hedged against losing before the armies even lined up. On the 1st of December, 355, Julian left Milan for Gaul. He had a small personal retinue, no military experience, and a province that had been functionally in enemy hands for years. His first campaign season produced modest but real results. He recovered Cologne from the Franks in 356, restored its defenses, negotiated with the Frankish leaders sufficiently to stabilize the lower Rhine, and began the difficult administrative work of reasserting Roman authority in a region accustomed to being ignored by Rome. Then winter arrived, and Julian made the first serious mistake of his command. He chose the small town of Sens, ancient Senones, southeast of Paris, as his winter quarters, dispersing most of his army to other towns to spread the burden of supply. A large band of Alemanni learned he was isolated and descended on the town. For approximately 30 days, Julian was besieged with a garrison so small he couldn't attempt a sortie. The enemy was outside. His general Marcellus, stationed nearby with the main body of the army, refused to come to his relief. Marcellus's reasons for inaction are nowhere defended. Ammianus characterizes the failure in terms that make his position clear: cowardice, or something indistinguishable from it in its consequences. Julian's dispatches to Constantius resulted in Marcellus being dismissed as master of cavalry and replaced by Severus, described in multiple sources as a distinguished, veteran officer considerably more compatible with the young Caesar's increasingly assertive command style. Julian had learned something that no philosophy text had taught him. In a politicized army, a general who fears your success will let you die, and the appropriate response is to ensure that general no longer commands anything. The following campaign season, 357, would be the decisive one. And Julian spent the intervening months preparing for it with a methodical attention to detail that was already distinguishing him from the commanders who had preceded him. He marched alongside his men rather than traveling in the comfort appropriate to his rank. He learned logistics through the experience of supply chains that failed and had to be rebuilt. He studied terrain the way he had once studied Plato, not as an abstract exercise, but as a practical problem requiring specific solutions. Ammianus would later compare him to Trajan in his willingness to share the physical hardship of the march, a comparison that carried enormous weight in the Roman military tradition. The troops began to respond. Not immediately and not universally. There were elements of Julian's army controlled by Constantius's appointments who would never fully be his men. But the Gallic legions, the soldiers who lived with him through the winter and marched with him in spring, began to see something in the young philosopher that the court in Milan had entirely failed to anticipate. He was learning faster than anyone had believed possible. And what he was learning, with every ambush survived and every shattered fortress rebuilt, was something more valuable than tactics. He was learning how to make men believe that following him was survivable. By spring of 357, Julian commanded an army that trusted him. It was a small army, an army that had been stripped of its best troops by Constantius's political maneuvering, an army facing a coalition that outnumbered it by more than 2 to 1. But it was his. The plan that would bring all of it to a single afternoon on the Rhine required one more piece: a partner force under a general named Barbatio. That partnership would prove to be something considerably worse than nothing. The plan looked elegant from Constantius's headquarters in Milan. 2 Roman forces, Julian with 13,000 men moving east from Reims, Barbatio with 25,000 advancing north from Augst, would trap the Alemanni between them in a classic pincer movement. The combined force of 38,000 Romans would be more than sufficient to destroy Chenodomar's confederation decisively, restore the Rhine frontier, and allow Constantius to present his court with a tidy victory in the west, while he attended to the Sassanids in the east. The plan required 2 commanders to cooperate. That was the problem. Within weeks of the campaign beginning, Alemanni forces punched through the gap between the 2 Roman columns and raided deep into Gaul, reaching as far as Lyon. Julian dispatched cavalry to intercept them on their return journey, successfully capturing many of the raiders. Others escaped, allegedly because Barbatio's men allowed them through. Whether this represented negligence or something more deliberate, Ammianus's tone regarding Barbatio throughout the campaign is consistently damning. When Julian attempted to use Barbatio's boats to clear Alemanni forces from islands in the Rhine, Barbatio refused. The refusal itself was notable. What happened next was extraordinary. Barbatio burned his own boats, deliberately destroying the only river transport available to either Roman commander, ensuring that Julian's Rhine operations remained constrained. Shortly after, Alemanni forces struck at Barbatio's supply column. His army retreated south of Augst. He placed his troops into winter quarters and returned to Constantius's court, leaving the campaign entirely. 25,000 Roman soldiers removed from the strategic equation without a single serious pitched engagement. The pincer had collapsed. Worse, the Alemanni had drawn precisely the intelligence lesson Chenodomar needed. The deserter from Barbatio's shattered force, from the Scutarii regiment, according to the account preserved by Malavus, told the Alemanni king exactly how many men Julian had left: 13,000. Chenodomar had just defeated an army twice that size. His response was to order a mass mobilization of the entire confederation. The force that assembled at the Rhine represented the largest Germanic levy in the region's history. Kings who had been neutral were pressured to join. Kings who had been allied with Rome were coerced or worse. Gundamad murdered, Wadamar threatened. The tribes near Radia, that Constantius had pacified the previous year, found their pro-Roman leaders violently overthrown and replaced with men willing to march. When the army finally crossed the Rhine, they took 3 full days to complete the crossing. A captured scout told the Romans this himself, the information passing up the chain to Julian with the weight of a formal announcement. The enemy was coming, and it was everyone. Chenodomar followed the crossing with a diplomatic gesture that left no room for ambiguity. He sent Julian an ultimatum: evacuate Alsace immediately, or face the full force of everything that had just spent 3 days crossing his river. Julian read the ultimatum. He sent it back unanswered. The decision to fight rather than withdraw and await reinforcements was not impulsive. As the scholar Adam Hu has analyzed, Julian had strategic reasons to believe a pitched battle was viable. The Alemanni were, for once, concentrated rather than dispersed in raiding bands. A decisive victory now could end the war rather than merely winning a season. His army was demanding action. A withdrawal would damage morale and potentially invite the sedition that was never far from the surface in any Roman command. And he had serious doubts that Constantius, who had already allowed one co-commander to sabotage the campaign, would send the reinforcements that a cautious strategy required. The only question left was where to fight. Julian already knew the answer. Picture the ground outside Argentoratum in late summer, 357. The Rhine runs to the east, not the distant Rhine of maps and theory, but the actual river, cold and fast, pressing against the eastern edge of every possible battlefield. Dense forest closes in from the west, ancient trees pressing together in the way that Germanic woodland did throughout this region, impenetrable to formed cavalry, channeling movement onto the paths between the trees. In the middle, a gently sloping hill, and at the bottom of the slope, the flat ground where an army assembles when it believes the advantage of numbers makes terrain irrelevant. Julian took the hill. The strategic elegance of this choice cannot be overstated. 35,000 warriors compressed between a river and a forest had, in practical terms, a fighting frontage of roughly 1 mile. The numerical advantage that made Chenodomar so confident, the advantage that his deserter intelligence had confirmed in precise terms, was physically constrained by the ground itself. His men would have to attack uphill against armor superior to their own, with the river behind them cutting off retreat and reinforcement simultaneously. The mathematics of geography had begun working for Rome before a single weapon was raised. Julian's battle formation was laid out with deliberate precision. His infantry stood in 2 lines, a front line of legions and elite auxiliary units, and a reserve line behind them with the most trusted heavy infantry held back for the crisis moment he knew would come. On the right flank of the front line, Ammianus places his crack auxilia palatina, the Cornuti and the Bracciati, partially Germanic-born soldiers who fought for Rome with a ferocity that their contemporaries found remarkable. The reserve center held the Primini Legion and the Batavians. The entire cavalry force was posted on the right wing, where Julian intended to deliver his decisive blow. In the gap between his 2 infantry lines, Julian himself took position with his escort of 200 picked cavalry. Far enough back to see the entire field, close enough to intervene anywhere within minutes. Against this, Chenodomar assembled his own deployment. His cavalry and a concealed force of light infantry were anchored on his left, opposite Julian's cavalry wing, and those light infantry had a specific assigned purpose that Julian did not yet know about. On the Alemanni right, in the heavy woods that pressed against the northern edge of the battlefield, Chenodomar's nephew Serapio commanded a hidden force, waiting for the signal to fall on the Roman left flank. The Germanic center was massed in depth. Some estimates based on Ammianus suggest roughly 25 ranks deep, the kind of formation that sacrifices tactical flexibility for the weight of a wall of human bodies. Chenodomar himself dismounted before the battle began. This was not his choice. His warriors, who had prepared with the cheerful suspicion of men who knew their king well, had demanded that he and the other chieftains fight on foot, lest they abandon the army if the battle went against them. The chronicles record this demand without editorial comment, but its meaning is clear. The men who were about to stake their lives on this assault did not entirely trust the man who had assembled it. Chenodomar accepted the demand. Ammianus records what Julian's army was thinking about on their hilltop in the late summer afternoon, watching 35,000 warriors take their positions in the valley below. According to the account that Ammianus drew from those who served in that campaign, Julian rode his lines with the care of a man who understood he was being watched, not just by his army, but by Constantius's agents embedded in the force. He could not appear too eager for personal glory. He had to encourage without overreaching, he had to prepare men for the most dangerous afternoon of their lives while performing political modesty for an emperor who feared his success. Then Serapio moved his men in the woods, and everything started. The battle began not with a charge, but with a pause. As Julian's infantry advanced down the slope in their two disciplined lines, the Roman left wing, commanded by Severus, Julian's experienced second-in-command, detected movement in the forest. The trees on the northern edge of the battlefield were not empty. Serapio had concealed a substantial force there, positioned to spring on the Roman left flank once the main engagement began. The ambush had been part of the plan from the beginning, the kind of tactical sophistication that should be acknowledged in any honest account of this battle, regardless of how it ended. Chenodomar was not improvising. He had prepared a layered assault with a hidden component, and it was Severus's professional alertness, not any Germanic failure of concealment, that undid it. Severus halted the entire left wing. The advance stopped. A gap opened between the halted left and the advancing center, and the Roman line, which should have been moving as a unified front, suddenly had an irregular shape that could invite exploitation. Julian rode from his position in the gap between his two lines toward the left wing to see the situation himself. The intervention that followed demonstrates something that no amount of philosophical education can fully explain, and that 2 years of campaigning had apparently instilled in him completely. An operational commander's instinct for the point where his personal presence changes the outcome. He assessed Serapio's hidden force, coordinated an infantry response to clear the woods. Military historians analyzing the engagement have suggested that artillery pieces called carrobalisti, bolt throwers drawn from the nearest legion, may have been brought to bear on the tree line, though Ammianus does not state this explicitly. And within the opening minutes of the battle, the Alemanni right wing was broken and in retreat, Severus pressing hard after them. The trap that Chenodomar had prepared on his right flank had failed before it could spring. The battle's opening sequence had gone to Rome. This mattered more than it might appear. Chenodomar had designed a simultaneous assault. The concealed force on the right, his cavalry with its hidden infantry counter-tactic on the left, and the massed center all pressing together. When Severus neutralized the right before it could act, and when Julian's rapid response prevented the gap from being exploited, the Alemanni lost the coordinated opening they had prepared. What Chenodomar had planned as a synchronized, overwhelming force had become, in the first minutes, a disjointed series of engagements. But his left wing had not yet moved, and Julian's cavalry on the Roman right were already beginning their charge. The Alemanni left wing commanded by Chenodomar himself, cavalry interspersed with light infantry assigned to a specific purpose, waited for them. Rome's most fearsome soldiers weren't stopped by the enemy. They were stopped by the enemy's infantry, and then they stopped themselves. The cataphracti, who formed the core of Julian's cavalry wing, were among the most formidable shock weapons in the late Roman arsenal. Armored from helmet to hoof in overlapping scales of iron and bronze, armed with a heavy Contus lance and a sword, mounted on horses bred for the steppe warfare that had produced their equipment. They were designed for a single devastating purpose: the shock charge that shattered formations and turned a defensive line into a rout. 2 full regiments of them, at minimum 1,000 heavy cavalry, plus conventional cavalry on either side and light-mounted archers on the extreme right. They were Julian's best offensive asset, his intended battle winner, the piece of the tactical equation that was supposed to make the numbers irrelevant. Chenodomar had spent the months before this battle figuring out how to kill them. The light infantry distributed throughout his cavalry wing had a specific assignment. When the Roman heavy horse charged, get underneath the horses. pull them down by whatever means available, hamstring them, drive spears under the scale armor covering their legs and chests, create chaos at ground level where heavily armored cavalry are most vulnerable. And it worked. Ammianus's account of what followed is precise in the way that accounts drawn from eyewitness testimony tend to be precise about disasters. The interspersed foot warriors wreaked havoc, bringing down the horses of the cataphracts and then killing their riders as they lay helpless in their armor on the ground. Then one of the cataphract tribunes, a regimental commander, was wounded. Professional soldiers understand the psychology of this. An officer going down in the middle of a deteriorating engagement doesn't just remove a commander. It confirms, to every man around him, that the situation is worse than they thought. The cataphracts panicked. The entire formation broke, wheeled, and fled the field, not toward the enemy. In their headlong retreat, they came back through the Roman lines, crashing into the infantry on the right flank, the very men who were supposed to be advancing in coordinated support. Here is where the battle might have ended. A broken cavalry force crashing into its own infantry at speed and in panic can trigger exactly the kind of cascading collapse that converts a difficult battle into a catastrophe. What prevented it was the quality of the units stationed on the Roman right flank. The cornuti and the bracciati, the crack auxilia palatina, whom Ammianus specifically singles out for their steadiness. Germanic-born soldiers fighting for Rome, they held their formation through the collision, absorbed the chaos of the fleeing cavalry, and maintained the Roman line. The cataphracts poured past and behind them, taking refuge in the space between the front and reserve lines. Julian was already moving. Ammianus records, and this detail is confirmed through multiple secondary sources drawing from the same account, that he rode forward personally, raising his Draco, the dragon standard of the cavalry wing, to stem the flight. The hollow bronze dragon's head with its windsock bodytail was both a signal and a statement. The commander was at the crisis point. The crisis was manageable, and the men who had fled were expected to return. Ammianus's account suggests he was at least partially successful. Most of the cavalry reformed. One regiment did not. The historian Zosimus, writing approximately a century and a half after the events, records what happened to that regiment after the battle. Julian's punishment for the unit that refused to return to the fight was to have its soldiers parade wearing women's clothes, a humiliation designed to make explicit what their behavior had demonstrated. Zosimus is the sole source for this detail, and it should be attributed as such. But it is consistent with what every other source records about Julian's character, his theatrical precision in matters of military discipline, and his understanding that armies run on reputation as much as they run on iron. The battle was now an infantry fight. Julian's best weapon was behind his own lines, partially broken, partially shamed. His army was outnumbered nearly 3-1 by warriors who had just watched Rome's cavalry destroy itself. Cnodamar saw the opening. His infantry gave a great roar and came forward. 35,000 warriors charging a shield wall held by 13,000 makes for a certain kind of mathematics, the kind that should produce one result and somehow kept producing another. The sound would have been audible for miles. The Germanic war cry building from thousands of throats simultaneously, the thunder of boots on the hillside slope, the crash of bodies against locked shields that Ammianus compares to the testudo, the locked shield formation that Roman soldiers trained for from the beginning of their service. The comparison is a simile, rather than a description of literal tortoise formation. What the Roman front line presented was a standard two-line defense with shields overlapping in the close order style that Roman infantry had perfected over 3 centuries. Spears projecting through the gaps at the height that was most inconvenient for a running man who had just charged uphill. The Germanic warriors were, by documented account, larger and stronger than the Romans facing them. This is not a diplomatic concession on Ammianus's part. It appears in his text as a tactical reality. What the Romans had instead was armor. Roman mail and partial plate absorbed impacts that leather jerkins and wooden shields did not. A blow that wounded or killed an unarmored Germanic warrior might bruise a Roman legionary. The asymmetry of protection made the asymmetry of size less relevant than it appeared. The cornuti and the bracciati, who had already demonstrated their quality by holding formation through the cavalry collision, now became the battle's most important units. Ammianus praises them specifically, and the praise is justified by what they were doing. Fighting in close order against warriors who were physically their superiors, while fatigued from the earlier chaos, while outnumbered, while the fate of the entire Roman position in Gaul pressed against their shields with every Germanic rush. The Germanic warriors fought with what Ammianus acknowledges as genuine courage. He is notably fair on this point, perhaps because many of his own countrymen were among the men attacking, and perhaps because accuracy required it. The Alemanni were not beaten soldiers being pushed by momentum. They were committed warriors trying to break a wall that would not give. And they kept trying with the kind of persistence that deserves to be named honestly, even when describing a defeat. But the mathematics were moving in a direction that Chenodomar may not have fully anticipated. Every charge absorbed by the Roman line cost the Alemanni warriors they could not easily replace. Every man who fell attacking uphill against armored opposition was a man who was not there for the next charge. The wall held for what Ammianus describes as a long time. The phrase is imprecise, but suggests the kind of sustained engagement measured in hours rather than minutes. And in that long time, the casualties accumulating on the Alemanni side were accumulating at a rate that Rome's outnumbered line was not matching. At some point in the afternoon, Chenodomar recognized that frontal assault alone was not going to solve his problem. He had a different tool available. His best warriors, the nobles and their personal retinues, the men who had trained for their entire lives for exactly this kind of close, decisive fighting. He assembled them behind the Germanic front line. The front ranks opened, and something different came through. Here is the detail that military historians keep returning to when they analyze Argentoratum, not as a curiosity, but as the moment when the entire battle balanced on a single tactical decision and came closer to going the wrong way than the eventual casualty figures might suggest. Chenodomar's assembled warriors formed into what Ammianus describes as a dense mass. The Latin term the historian uses is globus, a concentrated sphere of men pressed together, nobles and their retinues with armored warriors on the outside and the driving force at the core. Military scholars analyzing the formation have identified it as the caput porcinum, the quote 7 or quote 8 a wedge formation used by both Romans and Germanic tribes, designed not for broad engagement, but for penetration. A narrow, armored point driving through the front line at a single concentrated location, creating a breach that the warriors behind it could exploit before the defense could close. The Germanic front ranks opened deliberately, let the wedge through, and it drove into the Roman line with concentrated force at a single point. It worked. The Roman front line, which had held against everything thrown at it for hours, cracked. The wedge penetrated through the front rank and into the Roman position behind it. This is not ambiguous in Ammianus's account. The line broke. The most disciplined infantry force in the Western Empire, positioned on high ground with every tactical advantage except numbers, was breached by an elite Germanic assault at the point of maximum commitment. Whatever calculation Julian had made when he chose to advance rather than wait, The bill for that calculation had just come due. What happened in the next minutes is the moment that separates this battle from the theoretical engagement, where the smaller, more disciplined force wins by holding formation and grinding the larger opponent down. The reserve line moved. The Primini Legion, one of the most prestigious heavy infantry units in Julian's army, held back precisely for this moment, advanced from the reserve into the breach. The Batavians, elite auxiliaries known across the empire for their ferocity, moved with them. Where the wedge had created an opening, the reserve closed from behind it, forming a contracting position around the Germanic warriors who had driven through. The men who had penetrated deepest into the Roman formation, the best warriors, the nobles, the elite of the Alemanni Confederation, were now surrounded by fresh troops on multiple sides. They had driven into what had become, in the space of minutes, a trap built from their own success. The caput porcinum that had been designed to shatter Rome's center became instead the site of its own destruction. Fresh Roman infantry against men who had been fighting and pushing uphill for hours. The encirclement tightened. The wedge that had cut through Rome did not cut out the other side. Ammianus describes the Roman counterattack with the satisfaction of a man who understood that what had just happened was extraordinary. The line had broken. The reserve had closed it. The battle's most dangerous moment had been survived through the exact mechanism, the second line, the trained response to breakthrough. That Roman military organization had built for precisely this scenario. 3 centuries of tactical doctrine, tested and refined, had just earned its existence. When the Germanic warriors who had driven the wedge were gone, the remaining Alemanni front line faced a Roman formation that had absorbed their best attack, destroyed their best men, and was now pushing forward. The wedge had been the plan. There was no plan after the wedge. What followed was not a Roman triumph so much as a Germanic exhaustion. The Alemanni warriors who had been charging uphill for hours had given everything to the assault that Chenodomar had designed as the decisive blow. And the decisive blow had been absorbed, reversed, and turned against the men who had delivered it. The front line of Germanic warriors, which had been pressing against the Roman shield wall with something close to fury, was now pressing against a Roman line that had found its second wind from the reserve reinforcement, that was pushing rather than absorbing, that was advancing into men whose legs and arms had been working in the summer heat against armored opponents for longer than any body can sustain that kind of effort. The structural weakness of Chenodomar's coalition became, in this moment, something more than a political observation. An army of professional soldiers with unified command and institutional discipline can hold a deteriorating position through training, through the knowledge that breaking formation is more dangerous than maintaining it, through the reinforced habit of staying. A confederation of tribal warbands under multiple kings, most of whom had been coerced or threatened into joining, bound by momentum and greed rather than loyalty, does not have those same mechanisms. When the momentum reversed, when the certainty of victory that had held the Confederation together dissolved, the institutional glue was no longer there. One unit began to give ground, then another. The Roman advance, steady, disciplined, the front and reserve lines now pressing as a unified force, converted the Alemanni's tactical retreat into something faster. Faster became faster still. The cornuti and brachiati, their war chant, the Germanic Baritis, building from a low murmur to a thundering roar, audible across the entire battlefield, pushed the Germanic right. The reformed cavalry, shamed and recommitted, pressed the flanks. And behind the entire Alemanni army, the Rhine waited. What Ammianus describes and what multiple secondary sources drawing from his account confirm, is a collapse that became comprehensive with remarkable speed once it began. A coalition is a sum of individual calculations, and the individual calculation, stay and die or run and live, had shifted its answer. The pullback degenerated, as such things do, into something that could no longer be called a tactical withdrawal. Three things distinguished what followed from a conventional defeat. The river was behind them. The terrain they had to cross to reach it was the same ground they had spent hours ascending. And Julian's cavalry, no longer a broken instrument of shame, was now exactly the kind of force that pursuits require. Fast, mounted, capable of running down infantry who had just spent an afternoon in close combat and were now trying to cross water in armor. The king with his escape boats was somewhere in the chaos, moving toward the Rhine with the decision he had apparently prepared for. The rout reached the Rhine, and the river became the final accounting. Most of the fleeing Alemanni made the crossing. The Rhine is wide but crossable in summer, and the majority of warriors who reached the water were not wearing the heavy armor that made swimming fatal. Thousands escaped. The Roman pursuit, while aggressive, could not contain the full width of the retreat. But men in any armor, after hours of uphill fighting in summer heat, are not strong swimmers. Ammianus records that many drowned. The Roman cavalry at the river's edge killed with arrows and spears the men struggling in the water, unable to turn and fight, unable to reach the far bank. The deaths in the river were uncountable in a way that battlefield dead were not. The current took them downstream, past any possibility of systematic accounting. Chnodomar had moved faster than his warriors toward the river. The escape boats he had arranged were waiting. But the Roman cavalry, whose performance in the pursuit phase bore no resemblance to their performance in the battle's opening, had reached the riverbank ahead of or alongside him. The boats were inaccessible. Chnodomar turned from the river, moved with whatever warriors were still with him, and made for a small hill in the final territory between the battlefield and the Rhine. He was surrounded there. Ammianus preserves the detail with the specificity of a historian, drawing on accounts from men who had been present. Chnodomar surrendered on that hill with approximately 200 attendants and 3 close companions. The giant, the gold-helmeted king, who had sent Julian a formal ultimatum demanding the evacuation of Alsace, who had routed a Roman army twice Julian's size weeks before this afternoon, who had spent the preceding years conducting himself as the effective sovereign of territory Rome had once considered its own, surrendered to a 25-year-old who had arrived in the West in a student's gown 2 years earlier. Julian dispatched him to Constantius's court at Mediolanum, Milan. From there, Chnodomar was transferred to Rome itself and confined on the Caelian Hill. He died in Roman captivity approximately 2 years later. The escape boats had been waiting at the wrong place on the wrong afternoon. The secondary accounting of prisoners was staggering. 7 subordinate kings and 10 princes had participated in the battle. Several were captured or neutralized in its aftermath. The entire upper command structure of the Alemanni Confederation, which had taken years and considerable coercion to assemble, was gone in a single day. Ammianus records that large numbers of Alemanni captives, the scale was significant enough that multiple sources referred to it, were distributed across Gaul in the weeks that followed. Enrolled in labor service and auxiliary military units, the manpower of the Confederation converted into a resource for the province it had just tried to destroy. The coalition built on distrust had found in the end the result that distrust reliably produces. Then came the counting. The Roman casualties at Argentoratum are among the most precisely documented figures in all of ancient military history. not because ancient historians were generally precise about such things, but because Ammianus Marcellinus had access to the actual muster records of Julian's army. As the scholar Adam Howe has established in his analysis of the battle's sources, Ammianus was involved in the organizational administration of the Western Army and had access to troop documentation. He can name 3 of the 4 Roman officers killed at Strasbourg because he had the records: Bainobodes, Laipso, and Innocentius. The 4th was a tribune whose name the records apparently did not preserve, or whose name Ammianus did not record. Some manuscript variations place the total Roman dead at 247 rather than 243. The difference is trivial. What is not trivial is the figure itself. 243 Roman soldiers killed in an engagement against 35,000 enemies. After the main battle cavalry had broken, crashed through their own lines, and partially refused to return to the fight. After the front line had been breached by an elite Germanic wedge. After hours of close combat against opponents who were physically larger and numerically overwhelming. 243. The Alemanni dead Ammianus records at 6,000 counted on the field. A Roman body count conducted after the pursuit. A figure that carries the inherent limitations of any tally made by the victors in the hours following a battle. It may be exact, it may be approximate. What it cannot be, given the dynamics of the engagement, the hours of uphill assault against armored opponents, the elite wedge destroyed in the encirclement, the drowning in the Rhine, is a significant exaggeration. The Roman line had been accumulating Germanic dead since the first charge. 6,000 is what the ground showed when the counting was done, before the river's contribution was added to an uncountable total. The ratio, approximately 25 Roman deaths for every 100 Alemanni killed, demands comparison to establish its meaning. At Cannae in 216 BC, Hannibal's encirclement of the Roman army produced what military historians have long considered one of the most devastating casualty ratios in ancient warfare. Roughly 50,000 Romans killed against perhaps 6,000 Carthaginians, an 8-to-1 advantage in favor of Carthage. Cannae is taught in military academies as the model of tactical perfection. Argentoratum inverted it and exceeded it. What produced this outcome was not luck or divine intervention, though neither Ammianus nor Julian's other chroniclers entirely resist that framing. It was the specific accumulation of tactical factors. Uphill assault against superior armor, hours of sustained attrition against a line that held, the elite force destroyed in the failed wedge, and a river that collected the retreat. 4 named Romans lay dead on that hillside. The mathematics of training, formation, and terrain had done the rest. In the days that followed Argentoratum, Julian moved with the speed of a man who understood that victory was only the beginning of his problems. The military triumph had to be converted into territorial reality before the political reality could reassert itself. Ammianus records what the historian characterizes as a systematic campaign across Alsace. All Alemanni families who had settled on Roman land during the occupation years were rounded up and expelled across the Rhine. This was not reactive cleanup, but deliberate policy. The military outcome translated into the demographic terms that actually determined who controlled a province. The Germanic settlers who had treated the occupation as permanent were shown, within weeks of Chenodomar's capture, that it had not been. Julian did not stop at the Rhine. He crossed it. This was not tactically required. The battle had been won, the enemy routed, the king captured. A cautious commander consolidates, repairs, and waits for the following season. Julian pushed east into what is now Germany, penetrating deep enough to force 3 local Germanic kingdoms to submit, pay tribute, and acknowledge Roman sovereignty. The message delivered by this expedition was aimed less at the kingdoms he was visiting than at every tribe along the Rhine that had spent the preceding years watching Rome lose. The river was not a limit. It was a starting point. Rome could reach you in your home. The political reaction to this success was, predictably, complicated. Julian's soldiers, flush with the kind of victory that redefines a man's reputation in an afternoon, acclaimed him as Augustus, Constantius's equal, effectively a co-emperor. The acclamation was spontaneous and genuine and, under the constitutional arrangements of 357, constituted something dangerously close to treason. Julian refused it immediately and publicly, reminding his soldiers that the elevation of an Augustus was Constantius's prerogative alone. His reasons were calculation as much as loyalty. An unauthorized declaration of Augustus was the charge on which Gallus had died. And Julian had not survived a childhood massacre and 20 years of concealed identity to be executed for excessive popularity with his own troops. Behind the scenes, the response from Milan was what multiple historians describe and Britannica confirms: jealousy, barely contained. Constantius acknowledged the victory in official dispatches. He offered no triumph, no elevation in Julian's status, no recognition commensurate with saving the Western Empire. Julian remained a Caesar, a deputy, while the emperor who had spent the campaign seasons of 357 in the Balkans dealing with Sarmatian and Quadi incursions retained the title of Augustus and kept his agents in Gaul watching the young man he had sent there partly to disappear. The man who had saved Gaul had just made himself into the most dangerous person in Constantius's empire. Not because he had won, because now everyone knew he could. In the 3 years that followed Argentoratum, Julian governed Gaul with the same methodical, practical intelligence he had applied to winning his battle. The first priority was the civilians, and here Julian's record is documented in sources that rarely agree on anything about him. By Julian's own account, confirmed by Ammianus, he reduced the land tax burden on Gallic peasants by approximately 2/3, an act of administrative generosity that was simultaneously a political masterstroke. The previous tax burden had been administered by Constantius's praetorian prefect, Florentius, who managed Gaul's finances through extraction even during the worst years of the Germanic occupation. Julian and Florentius clashed repeatedly. Julian won. A population that could survive the winter was a population that did not flee, and a province that did not flee had people to work its fields and fill its defensive garrisons. The Rhine fortress system, shattered during the Civil War, unrepaired for nearly a decade, was systematically rebuilt. Fort by fort, garrison by garrison, the Limes Germanicus was restored from the ruins of a line that had existed only on maps to something that existed in stone and manning. Julian crossed the Rhine multiple times in the following campaign seasons, conducting punitive raids into Germanic territory, demonstrating that Rome's reach extended beyond the river's western bank, forcing treaties and tribute payments that created a buffer of compliant Germanic leadership between the Rhine and the deeper Confederation territories. Cities that had been abandoned during the occupation years were repopulated. The economic activity that generates tax revenue, trade, agriculture, the movement of goods along roads that were now safe enough to use, began to recover. By 359, Gaul was producing again in ways it had not produced since before Magnentius's coup a decade earlier. 3 years after Argentoratum, the consequences of Julian's success arrived in their most direct form. Constantius, pressed hard by the Sassanid Emperor Shapur II's renewed offensive in the east, ordered Julian to send his best Gallic troops as reinforcements, specifically the units who had fought at Argentoratum, the veterans who had made Julian's reputation. The order bypassed Julian and went directly to the unit commanders. It was, as the historian Adrian Murdoch and others have noted, almost certainly designed to weaken Julian's position as much as to strengthen the Eastern Army. The troops refused. The Petulantes regiment and others mutinied, refusing to march east, refusing to leave the commander who had marched alongside them, who had rallied them after the cavalry broke, who had given them a Gaul worth defending. They proclaimed Julian Augustus for the second time. And this time, in Paris, in the winter of 360, he did not refuse. The battle that was supposed to kill him had given him an army. The army had given him an empire. Argentoratum is not Thermopylae. It is not Cannae. It does not appear in the popular consciousness of ancient military history with anything approaching the recognition those battles command, despite producing casualty ratios that exceed either and a documented tactical record that most military historians consider genuinely extraordinary. The reasons for this are worth examining, because they reveal something about how history is remembered that matters beyond any single battle. Julian the Apostate is not a figure that Christian historiography, which dominated the writing and preservation of the ancient record for the centuries immediately following his death, had any incentive to celebrate. He was the emperor who had tried to reverse the Christianization of the empire, who had reopened pagan temples, who had been called the apostate in a deliberate act of posthumous diminishment by the tradition that outlived him. His victories in Gaul were not erased. They are too well documented in Ammianus for that. But they were not amplified. The battle that saved Roman Gaul was won by a man whom the dominant tradition of the following centuries had every reason to keep in the margins. The Alemanni themselves were not finished by Chenodomar's capture. The historian Peter Heather, whose work on the fall of Rome remains essential reading in the field, is direct about this. The defeat of Chenodomar did not mean the total destruction of the alliance at whose head he had stood. Within a decade of Argentoratum, a new Alemanni paramount leader named Vadimarius was causing Roman commanders the same difficulties Chenodomar had caused them. The confederation that had been defeated at Strasbourg reconsolidated under new leadership, resumed pressure on Roman borders by the 370s, and remained a factor in Germanic politics for generations, eventually contributing warriors to Attila's coalition at the Catalonian plains in 451. Rome won the battle. The underlying pressure did not stop. What Argentoratum did achieve was time, a decade of relative stability on the Rhine frontier. The restoration of a defensive system that had been functionally absent for years. The economic recovery of one of Rome's most valuable provinces. And the creation, through 3 years of brilliant administration following the victory, of a man capable of governing the empire, though he would not live long enough to demonstrate what that governance might have produced in full. The ground where all of this happened is not empty. The ancient fortress of Argentoratum underlies the modern city of Strasbourg, capital of the Alsace region of France, seat of the European Parliament and the European Court of Human Rights. The battle that preserved Roman Gaul was fought in the same valley that now houses the principal institutions of European cooperation. The organizations built in the long aftermath of a different conflict 16 centuries later to make such battles unnecessary. The mathematics of that coincidence is not military. But it is worth noting. Julian became sole emperor of Rome on the 3rd of November, 361, not through conquest, but through circumstance. Constantius II, who had spent the preceding months marching west to suppress his rebellious cousin's army, died of fever in Cilicia before the civil war he had been preparing could begin. In his final days, by multiple accounts, he named Julian as his successor. The last remaining male member of the Constantine dynasty, the student who had arrived in Gaul wearing his academic gown, was now the most powerful person in the Western world. His first acts were characteristic. He expelled the court eunuchs, drastically reduced the imperial household, opened the pagan temples, and ordered the restoration of sacrificial worship. He had been concealing his beliefs for 20 years. He was not inclined to continue. The Christians of the empire called him the apostate. Julian would have considered the label accurate and insufficiently specific. He ruled for 19 months. In the spring of 363, he launched the campaign that was supposed to complete Alexander's legacy, a massive assault on the Sassanid Empire, aimed at Ctesiphon, the Persian capital. The campaign's opening phases went well. Then Julian made the catastrophic decision to burn his own supply fleet on the Euphrates, believing his army would not need to retreat. They needed to retreat. During the fighting withdrawal up the Tigris Valley at the Battle of Samara on the 26th of June, 363, Julian was struck by a spear and mortally wounded. He died the same evening. The circumstances of his death are genuinely disputed in the ancient sources, in the way that the deaths of significant figures often become disputed when different traditions have different interests in the answer. The pagan historian Libanius, who had known Julian personally, suggested that the spear came not from a Persian, but from a Christian soldier in Julian's own army, a suggestion that modern historians treat with appropriate caution. No source permits certainty. Ammianus, who served in the Persian campaign, does not identify the thrower. The mystery has not been resolved and probably cannot be. What the military record shows, without serious dispute, is that Julian was never defeated in the field in Gaul or elsewhere. In 8 years of command, from the siege of Sens in 356 to the fighting withdrawal in Persia in 363, he did not lose a pitched engagement. What ended him was a strategic overreach, not a tactical failure. The distinction matters, though it did not matter to Julian. Ammianus Marcellinus, who served with Julian on the Persian campaign and wrote the most detailed surviving account of his reign, compared him to Trajan as a general. The Osprey campaign volume on his Gallic campaigns is subtitled "The Victory That Saved Gaul," a judgment that mainstream scholarship endorses. Both assessments begin with one battle, on one afternoon in late summer, when 13,000 soldiers held a hillside against 35,000. When the cavalry broke and the line cracked and the reserve closed it. When a 25-year-old philosopher from Athens rode forward through the chaos of his own breaking army with a dragon standard in his hand and refused to accept that the mathematics had already written the outcome. He was right. 16 centuries have passed since Ammianus sat down to record what happened outside Argentoratum, and the questions the battle raises have not simplified with time. The numbers tell a part of the story that cannot be argued away. 243 Romans against 6,000 Alemanni dead on the field, with an unknown additional toll drowning in the Rhine. A casualty ratio that exceeded Cannae in the opposite direction. One king captured with 200 attendants on a hill, his escape boats inaccessible, his coalition dissolved in an afternoon. These are administrative records, body counts, documented facts preserved because Ammianus had access to the muster rolls and the professional discipline to use them. But the numbers don't answer the human question that the battle raises. Cnodamar had everything that military logic says produces victory. He had the numbers, he had the intelligence, he had the record. He had fresh memory of destroying a Roman army twice the size of the one facing him. What he didn't have, and what no intelligence report could have delivered, was an accurate picture of the man standing in the gap between those two infantry lines. You can count soldiers, you cannot count commanders. What Argentoratum demonstrates, in its documented detail, is what professional military organization does when the mathematics say it should fail. The Roman line held, not because Roman soldiers were braver than Germanic warriors. Ammianus himself is clear that the Alemanni fought with genuine valor. It held because the line was designed to absorb what it absorbed and to respond as it responded. The second line held because second lines are trained to hold. The reserve closed the breach because reserves are positioned to close breaches. The cavalry, shamed and reformed, ran down the retreat because cavalry is built for pursuits. When Chenodomar's best attack had been spent, Rome's institutional design had one more move available. The exhausted warriors attacking uphill did not. Julian reduced the taxes of Gallic farmers by 2/3. He rebuilt the Rhine forts. He repopulated the abandoned cities. He governed a province that had been functionally lost and returned it to a condition where it could defend itself. He was not, in 357, trying to save Western civilization. He was trying to do his job, under surveillance, in a province his cousin had sent him to lose in. The fact that doing his job meant something larger than he could have known is not unusual in history. It is what history mostly consists of. The dragon standard is gone. The hill at Argentoratum is buried under 16 centuries of continuous settlement. The men named Bainobaudes, Laipso, and Innocentius, Rome's dead preserved by name in a muster record that Ammianus had access to, are otherwise completely unknown to us. 400 years of Roman Gaul followed the afternoon they died on. The European Parliament meets 40 kilometers from where they stood. 13,000 men, 35,000 enemies. One dragon standard raised in the middle of a breaking line. The mathematics said it was impossible. The mathematics were wrong.